Imagine a 19-year-old girl, once hailed by soldiers as a deliverer, now bound to a stake in the middle of a foreign city square. The smoke rises. The crowd presses in. In the last moments, witnesses recorded that she cried the name of Jesus, a single, raw sound that cut through the chaos. This is how Joan of Arc's story reaches its most unbearable question. How did a living symbol of French resistance end up burned as a heretic? And what dark secrets from her months in captivity made that outcome possible? To answer that, we must step back to the spring of 1430. Joan had already ridden with banners, won battles, and altered the course of a war. But war is also commerce and calculation. In May 1430, she was seized not by the French king, but by allies turned rivals, Burgundian forces, and, according to the records, sold to the English. The transaction reduced a charismatic leader to a bargaining chip. English authorities transported her to their administrative centre and placed her under guard in a fortified prison in an English-held city name Indefinido. From that point on, she ceased to be solely a military figure. She became a political prize, and everything that followed was shaped by that status. The fortress where she was held was not a quiet cell with a single jailer and a sympathetic priest. Trial records and later testimony paint a harsher picture. A military stronghold, men on watch at all hours, chains and blocks intended to restrain movement and dignity. Witnesses at the 1456 rehabilitation trial remembered her chained to a wooden block and at times shackled, exposed to the constant presence and proximity of male guards. Illness settled in, a fever here, a persistent cough there, and yet access to pastoral care and sacraments was limited, delayed, or contested. Those who later spoke of these months described not merely imprisonment, but a daily erosion of the conditions that might protect a prisoner's legal or spiritual rights. The humiliation of confinement was compounded by repeated harassment and attempts to control her body and appearance. Several witnesses later testified that Joan was taunted and threatened. Some accounts indicate attempts at physical intimacies by her guards, though such allegations must be treated as statements in testimony rather than established fact. What is less disputed in the records is how vulnerable she was in the presence of armed men, and how that vulnerability shaped one of the central controversies that would determine her fate: the question of clothing. For Joan, the choice to wear male attire was not a matter of fashion or theological provocation alone. In her own defense, and in testimony recorded both in 1431 and later recounted in the rehabilitation proceedings, she explained that wearing men's clothing on certain occasions was a practical measure. It offered protection among soldiers and guards. It kept her safe from repeated exposure in quarters where women's dress would have left her open to insult or worse. Yet her judges treated this pragmatic explanation as a capital offence. To them, the uniform became evidence of deliberate, heretical transgression, a visible sign of a woman who defied the Church's expectations. In January 1431, an ecclesiastical court was convened to hear charges against Joan. The formal list of accusations included claims that she had worn men's clothing, that she asserted divine voices and visions, and that she refused to acknowledge the full authority of the Church. Those are the headline items. Beneath them lay a process that would unsettle even some of the clerics present. The court was not a neutral forum. It sat in a location and under conditions that later critics argued violated canon norms. A trial held under the eye of secular power, in an environment where her guards and jailers were a constant presence. Counsel who might have defended her was effectively absent. Interrogators used tactics designed to trap her into statements that could be read as heretical. And when transcripts of the proceedings were compared in later years with witness statements, irregularities emerged. Passages that seemed edited, records that suggested the official version of events had been shaped to fit a predetermined outcome. The legal choreography was surgical. Questions were framed to force categorical answers about the origin of her visions, the identity of the voices she named, St. Catherine and St. Margaret among them, and the exact limits of her obedience to ecclesiastical authority. Joan answered with the blunt, religious language of a peasant girl steeped in devotional practice and battle-hardened obedience to a calling she said she could not deny. But each answer became fodder for a deliberation bent on showing her statements as disobedient or blasphemous. Some clerics grew uneasy. A few privately suggested the process felt rigged. Yet the machinery kept grinding. One of the most startling and consequential episodes during the hearings was the formal recantation. Under intense pressure described in later testimony as threats of harsher punishment and relentless confinement, Joan signed a statement renouncing the wearing of men's clothes and professing submission to ecclesiastical authority. To casual observers, this recantation might suggest guilt or contrition. In context, it reads differently. Testimony after the fact indicated that the recantation occurred in a setting where she had been isolated, fatigued, and desperate for relief. The paper she signed was described as compliant with the immediate need to end interrogation and gain brief respite. For a moment, the court claimed victory. The alleged heretic had admitted error. But the story did not end there. Within weeks, she was reported to have been found again in male attire. Here, the accounts diverge in tone and emphasis. Some records suggest that the return to men's clothes was deliberate. Others indicate she was coerced, or that the garments had been taken from her and then replaced by guards or servants, and that she resumed them as a matter of survival. Testimony at the later rehabilitation trial painted a picture of confusion and manipulation, of dresses stolen or denied, and of men's clothing offered as the only way to maintain decency in unguarded moments. Whatever the precise sequence, the judges invoked the concept of relapse, someone who had recanted and then returned to forbidden behavior. In the logic of the court, relapse equated to obstinacy and heresy, a legal finding that could transfer the matter from ecclesiastical sanction to secular execution. That procedural pivot, the narrowing of a complex life to a legal technicality, is one of the script's darkest secrets. The machinery of law supplied the appearance of legitimacy, a confession, a finding of relapse, a sentence. But the shadow behind that machinery was political, neutralizing a figure who had rallied French troops and the imagination of a people served the strategic interests of the English and their allies. Testimony in the 1456 retrial argued exactly this point, that the original process was marred by bias and external pressure, and that the legal formalities had been used to achieve a political end. The final days in Rouen were a study in grim theatre. The sentence pronounced in late May 1431 condemned Joan to be handed over to secular authorities for execution. Even here, elements of compassion and coercion coexisted. In the hours before the sentence was carried out, there were attempts, contested in the records, to provide her with sacraments, with candles, with a crucifix, improvised from 2 sticks. Witnesses reported that she clung to a small cross and that a priest, whose presence was debated in the testimony, offered words meant to prepare her for death. Some accounts describe an attempt by sympathetic figures to shield her from indignity. Other accounts underline how tightly the secular guards maintained control. On the day itself, the procession toward the place of execution was public, designed to be a moral display. The stake, the pile of wood, and the scaffold were arranged for spectacle. The crowd included curious citizens, soldiers, clerics, and officials. As the flames took hold, chroniclers reported that Joan uttered words recorded by onlookers, notably, a final cry invoking Jesus. The physical detail is spare in the sources. What persists is the symbolic weight of the moment. Her body was consumed in a ritual meant to erase her presence and to assert a narrative of condemnation. In some retellings, Ashes were cast into the river to prevent the gathering of relics. Several witnesses at the rehabilitation trial later said there had been efforts to destroy any traces that might make her martyrdom tangible. The aftermath of the execution did not produce the clean closure the authorities intended. Within a generation, those who had known Joan or had been involved in the earlier events began to speak with new clarity. In 1456, a formal rehabilitation trial was opened at the behest of Joan's family and supporters. This process revisited the records, summoned witnesses who had been present in 1430-31, and exposed procedural violations. Coerced testimony, absence of legitimate defense, irregular venue, and evidence that the court had been under secular influence. The panel concluded that the original trial had been unjust and declared Joan innocent of the charges that had led to her execution. Those findings reframed what had been presented as a legal judgment into a miscarriage of justice, a verdict that acknowledged the role of political motive in what had been called a religious trial. Even so, rehabilitation came slowly in public memory. For centuries, Joan's figure oscillated between myth and history, between instrument and saint. It was not until 1920 that the Church formally declared her a saint, canonizing her in recognition of the faith that had marked her life and the enduring devotion of those who regarded her as a martyr. That late formal recognition did not erase the record of counsel denied, of transcripts shaped to fit a narrative, or of the practical steps she had taken in prison to protect herself. Instead, it made her story more complicated, a martyr created by a mixture of courage, faith, and the politics of a world at war. So what are the genuine, shocking secrets of Joan's prison life, as the title promises? They are not lurid anecdotes fabricated by rumor. They are the established contours of coercion, the testimony about chains, men on constant watch, and the repeated intrusion of military authority into an ecclesiastical process. They are the practical reasons a young woman chose masculine clothing, and the legal mechanism by which that choice was turned into a capital offense. They are the documented irregularities of a trial, where counsel was absent, transcripts were later shown to be unreliable, and the judgment was rendered in a context saturated with political interest. They are the ways in which a system can transmogrify a living, breathing human being into a legal problem to be solved. Would you have recognized this as judicial murder? The question is not simply rhetorical. The 1456 retrial's conclusions press us to see the earlier events less as an inevitable collision of piety and law, and more as a targeted neutralization of a dangerous symbol. When law is used to bury politics in the language of heresy, the outcome resembles a calculated erasure. That is the uncomfortable truth that emerges when we look closely at the months Joan spent behind the fortress walls. Her last moments, the cross of Styx, the flames, the final invocation, remain seared into memory precisely because they were meant to silence a story. Instead, they transformed Joan of Arc into something harder to extinguish, a symbol whose life and death would be scrutinized, contested, and ultimately reclaimed. The rehabilitation trial stripped away some of the legal varnish applied in 1431. Canonization sealed her place in spiritual history. But the central moral of this sequence is not pious triumph. It is a warning about how easily legal forms can be enlisted to serve political ends, and how the vulnerabilities of imprisonment, chains, clothing, illness, isolation, can be turned into instruments of condemnation. If you came here for answers, the record gives both facts and open questions. We know how she was captured and transferred, the conditions witnesses described during her confinement, the procedural irregularities of the ecclesiastical court, and the sequence that led from recantation to the charge of relapse, and then to execution. We also know that later witnesses and jurists found those proceedings deeply flawed. What remains indefinido are some of the precise details of names and minor places in the hasty records of wartime administration. where the old transcripts garble a name or offer conflicting spellings. The safer path is to mark them for verification rather than to assert them as settled fact. Joan's prison life, the chains, the male guards, the contested clothing, the coerced recantation, the altered transcripts, offers a window into a legal system bending under external pressure. It explains how a peasant girl, who had once been hailed as a savior, could be delivered to fire under the claim of religious judgment. Her story, and the shocking secrets embedded in those months of captivity, ask us to look skeptically at the marriage of sword and crozier, and to remember that the truest reckoning often comes years later, when witnesses speak more freely and the law is willing to examine itself. If this episode of history struck you, consider diving deeper. There are transcripts, rehabilitation trial testimonies, and contemporary chronicles that unpack each claim. If you'd like more deep dives into moments where law, war, and faith collide, subscribe and join us in the next exploration. In the end, the image returns. A young woman tied to a stake, calling a name for comfort, while the state performs its judgment. The shocking secrets from her prison life are less scandal than method. They reveal how power finds its instruments, chains, clothing, confessions, and how those instruments can be assembled to silence a single voice that once changed the course of a nation.